Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. We have our Zoomers. Okay. Welcome, physical friends, and welcome, remote and virtual friends. Oh, wow. Nice turnout for the culminating seminar. Many people out there in the world. It turns out that Spain has no power. So perhaps half of Roger's fans are not able to attend from Iberia, but we shall see.
It's coming back on as we speak.
The power is coming back. Good. Well, we'll hope that our power stays on. Nice to have you for what is, as you know, the last seminar of the year in the workshop in the history of material texts. So first of all, our one thank you that is important that we make is to our audiences, because without people who care about the history of books and writing and printing and manuscripts and all of the reading and digital culture and all the things that we cover, we wouldn't actually have a future. So we're very grateful. You are also deputized as missionaries for next year to recruit new audiences, bring in your students of all levels. This, as most of you I think know, but in case there are a few who don't, this is an open seminar. There are no RSVPs. There is an attendance sheet that goes around. That's just in case we have to justify our existence to some member of the administration. We keep your private information private here in material texts, but it is important that the succeeding generations learn about this seminar, and it's very interdisciplinary, very cooperative project. So thanks to all who have participated throughout the term. We will, as ever, be announcing the lineup for next fall, somewhere in the later summer, and we are working on that now. So stay tuned. Some of you in this room may be contacted. I should introduce myself. I'm John Pollock. My co-organizers are Zach Lesser in the English department and Jerry Singerman, Emeritus Humanities Editor at the Penn Press. We have a board of advisors for whom we're also grateful for their assistance. And one of the most important thank yous that we need to make always at this ritual end of the year is to the Brisdell Schoenberg Fellow. That is essentially a fancy way of thanking the graduate student who does an incredible amount of legwork, logistically and otherwise. So, as Peter Diamond, our fellow this year, likes to say, he's the one who sends the email. So he has been that one, ordering the dinners, but actually also contributing substantially, intellectually, morally, spiritually, as well to the life of the seminar. So we're really grateful, Peter. We wish you good luck. Please stay in touch. If you ever want to talk about odd New England writers, you know where to turn. We're always here for you. And I'm happy also to introduce our fellow for next year, Priya Nambrath, who's a graduate student in South Asian Studies. She's in the back there. Already doing her first duty, which is to make sure you all have a handout. Thank you, Priya, and we look forward to having you. Are there any other announcements or points of order? Great. There are lots of books in the room. Apologies, Zoomers, but for those of you who can stay after the seminar, please do stay and look at some interesting volumes from our collections that will represent the rather impressive voyage that we'll take here tonight with Roger Chartier. So Roger Chartier is our friend and our colleague for many, many years. He needs no introduction, and he has in fact insisted that we provide no introduction. So I will not. I have, however, must have one sentence, and that is just to thank Roger Chartier for many things, but for his ongoing presence, for his incredible support for this seminar over many years, his collegiality to so many of us, his presence here on campus as teacher and fellow scholar, and more broadly for his unwavering support for the work of humanities and the work of universities in a time of difficulty and crisis. Enlightened Quipus, Françoise de Graffigny's Lettres Péruvienne and 18th-century French Incas. Roger.
Thank you very much, John, for this introduction. I would like to take your words and to apply them to you, because this seminar this afternoon is a result of a collaboration which can be embodied or expressed by the diversity of the written items we have on the different tables, books from the 16th, 17th, 18th century on this table, 19th century and out. You have received them now in your hands. A digital era PowerPoint and organized by John in a superb manner. And finally, orality. I have three reasons for presenting this research that follow up the seminar I gave 2 years ago about Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, Comentarios Reales. The book is there, and it was a recent acquisition by the library, the first edition, 1609. The first reason is the important collection of copies of Graffigny's Lettres d'une Péruvienne, owned by Penn Library. The second one is to pay homage to John Dejean's memories. She edited Graffigny Letters in 1993 and gave to the library her own personal, very rich collection of Graffigny's works, and particularly the first editions. The third reason is to contribute to the series of material text seminars, and this year, Rosenbach lecture, devoted to non-alphabetic codes, non-phonetic scripts, and in this case, the quipu that are present both in Graffigny's novel and for 16 of them in the collection of Penn Museum. Françoise de Graffigny, with 2 or only 1 F, Lettres d'une Péruvienne, was both a bestseller and a steady seller. Printed at the end of 1747, the book had 11 editions during the year 1748, all undated and with the same imprint à Penn, not Penn University, à Penn with difficulty, with pain. That hides this imprint, the actual places of printing. David Smith's superb bibliographie des œuvres de Madame de Graffigny allows us to identify in Penn Library 7 copies of the first editions, and among them 3 of the first one printed in Paris without privilege in this time, 1747, of the ban on the novel, and published, printed in Paris by Madame Pissot. The publisher gave to Graffigny 300 livres and 12 copies for her book. Between 1748 and 1752, 10 other editions were published in Amsterdam, in Lausanne, and already in English translations in London and Dublin. Revised and augmented for the edition published by the Parisian bookseller Duchesne in 1752, who paid 3,000 and no more 300, 3,000 livres for the new manuscript, the book became, with La Nouvelle Héloïse, the strongest steady seller of 18th century France, with 81 editions between 1752 and 1809. Its impact on French and European readership was increased by the suite, the sequels added by other authors as soon as 1748, by the translations, first in English, 1748, Italian, 1754, German, 1760, and then Russian, 1791, Spanish, 1792, and Portuguese, 1802. and also by the theatrical adaptation. For example, an opéra comique at Saint-Germain-Fair in Paris in 1754, or a play by Goldoni, La Peruviana, performed in the Theatre San Luca in Venice in 1755. But after 1835, Graffigny's novel disappeared from the French literary canon. It was rescued from oblivion by American feminist criticism. The French text was edited, as I said, by Joan de Jean and Nancy Miller in 1993, and it was translated the same year by David Cornacker. Both texts were published in the collection Text and Translation of the Modern Language Association of America. Since the 1990s on, Graffigny's novel has been the object of intense scholarship, dedicated to different aspects of the book, understood as a feminist novel, defending the education of the girl and taking distance vis-à-vis marriage. As a critique of French customs by a supposed foreigner's gaze, as in the case of Montesquieu's Lettres persanes, or as a love story located in an exotic setting. For this seminar, I shall focus the attention on a peculiarity of the work, the supposed materiality of the first 17 letters written by the daughter of the sun, Zilia, to the Inca prince, Asa, she loved, and with whom she must be married in the temple of the sun when the Spaniards entered into the city of the sun, slaughtered whatever stood in their way, and captured Zilia. These 17 letters were not written on paper with alphabetic characters. They were composed, according to Graffigny, with the chords and the notes of the Peruvian quipos or quipus. In his first letter, Zilia recalled that on the morning of her marriage and before the arrival of the Spaniards, she ran to her quipos. I quote, "I hastened to knot them, hoping with their assistance to immortalize the story of our love and our happiness." Graffigny added a note to the word quipos, and I quote, "A large number of short strings of different colors, un grand nombre de petits cordons de différentes couleurs, which the Indians, who had no system of writing, à défaut d'écriture, used to calculate payments for their troops or the number of their population. Some authors claim, pretend, are convinced that they also use them to record for posterity the memorable deeds of their Incas." In the historical introduction added in the 1752 edition, more precision is given. I quote, "The Peruvians were less enlightened, less knowledgeable, and less skilled than we are, and yet they were sufficiently advanced not to lack any necessity. Quapas or quipos took the place of our art of writing." And follow the text, cords of cotton or gut, boyaux, to which were attached other cords of different colors, recorded through a system of knots placed at varying distance, whatever they wished to remember. They served as annals, codes, rituals, and so on. They had public officers called quipocamayos who were entrusted with the safekeeping of the quipos. And the text concluded, "Finances, accounts, the payment of tributes, all aspects of business and all calculations could be handled easily with quipos as they could have been using writing." A note attached to the word quipo, again indicated, the quipos of Peru were also in use among other people of Southern America. If the reader of the novel can read the 17 first letters, the following one were written in French by Zilia, who learned the language after a second capture by a French officer, d'Etterville, and after her arrival in France. If the reader can read the Quipus letters, it is because Zilia recuperated them and translated them as it is indicated in the advertisement of the first edition. I quote, "It seems unnecessary to point out that Zilia herself translated her first letters. The reader will quickly realize that since they were composed in a language and recorded, tracé, in a manner which are both equally unknown to us, the letters in this collection would ever have come down to us if the same hand has not rewritten, écrit, them in our language." Zilia mentioned explicitly her quipus or quipos in 6 letters in the handout 1. Unless the first one was received and answered by Asa, but his letter is not published in this epistolary novel without correspondence. For her, the quipus can keep memories and communicate sentiments. Before the commotion, the arrival, brutal arrival of the Spaniards, she said, "This mass of countless cords became, in my fingers, a faithful record, une peinture fidèle, of our actions and our feelings, just as in the past they had expressed our thoughts during these long periods which we sent apart." Letter 1. With the separation, with the capture by the Spaniards, the quipu will be the only but fragile recourse for maintaining the correspondence between Zilia and Asa. I quote again the letters, the first letters. "In the midst of this dreadful upheaval, I do not know by what happy chance I kept my quipus with me. I have stand still, my dearest Asa. They are this day the only treasure of my heart, and they will let us express both your love and mine. The same notes which will tell you of my existence will tell me of your fate when they are retied in your hands, en changeant de forme entre tes mains. But alas," I follow the quote, "but alas, by what means I shall be able to send them to you? But by what cunning will they be returned to me? I do not yet know. But the same feelings which inspire us to put them to this use will also show us how to deceive our oppressors." The quipus gave to Zilia the illusion of a conversation with Asa. Letter number 4. "These notes, which touch my senses, seem to make my thoughts more real. The kind of resemblance I imagine them to have with words creates an illusion which brings relief to my suffering. I fancy that I am speaking to you, telling you that I love you, assuring you of my devotion, of my affection. This sweet delusion is my sole possession and my life." Unfortunately, Zilia's cords came to her hand, and for her, this is a second separation from Asa. Letter 17, the last one written with quotation mark with quipus. "I could continue to share with you, my dearest Asa, many observations I have made, but alas, I can see the end of my cordon. I am touching the last threads. I am tying the last knots. These knots, which seems to me to be a chain linking your heart to mine, are now no more than pitiful objects of my regret. Dearest Asa, I feel that we are being separated once more, that I am being snatched a second time from your love. I am losing you. I am leaving you. I shall see you no more, Asa. My heart's dear hope, how far apart we are to be. The last mention of Zilia's Quipus appears when she learned that Asa was free, lived in the court of Spain, and will come in Paris. D'Eterville, the French officer who was captured and after fall in love with Zilia, quote, has promised that he, Asa, will have my notes and my letters delivered to you. He has assured me that you would find interpreters to explain the letters to you, the French one. They have come to collect the packet. I must leave you. Farewell, dear hope of my life. I shall contribute to write. If I can find no means of sending my letter, I shall keep them for you. It's the letter 26. And when unfaithful Asa, who converted to Catholicism and married a Spanish woman, met Zilia in Paris, he returned to her notes and letters, which allow her to translate the letter and Madame de Graffigny to publish the first 17 letters. The fiction of the letters written, or better said, noted in Quipus, was received with suspicion or with enthusiasm by the readers of the novel in 1748 and the following years. In his review of the book, published in 1749, in the first volume of his Lettres sur quelques écrits de ce temps, Fréron, the anti-philosopher Fréron, considered this as implausible. Number 2, and out. The Quipus were only used to relieve the memory and not to compose letters. The Peruvians did not know the art of writing to the absent. They had couriers in relay from distance to distance who passed by word of mouth the order of the sovereign from one province to another, which proves that the Quipus were usually insufficient. Zilia could not therefore follow Fréron. Zilia could not therefore have made the Quipus the interpreters of her passion. But you would rightly accuse me of injustice and bad humor if I pointed out the defects of plausibility in the novels. It is a complete opposite side that took Raimondo de Sangro, Prince of San Severo, in a book published in Naples in 1750 and reviewed in the Jesuit Journal de Trévoux in February 1752. The journal presented the work as, I quote, far more singular in itself than all the mechanics of the Quipus. Raimondo de Sangro was an important figure of Italian radical enlightenment. In the cabinet or laboratory, said in his palace in Naples, he made experiments, invented mechanical devices, built anatomical machines still visible today, and printed his works on a press able to print multicolored characters and images. He was an encyclopedic antiquarian, an erudite who knows Hebrew, the founder of the first Masonic lodge in Naples, and a reader of Bell, the English moral philosophers, or Voltaire. As acknowledged the reviewer in the Jesuit Journal de Trévoux, these books quoted by the prince were dangerous books, and, said the reviewer, begotten by irreligion and welcomed by libertinage. Raimondo de Sangro, chaotic and disordered lettera, full of digressions and lengthy, immense notes, dealt with multiple topics: a commentary of his previous book on military art, the absence of the Inquisition in Naples, the miracle of San Gennaro, among other topics. The title of the text, however, indicated its main intention: apologetic letter containing the defense of the book entitled Letter of a Peruvian Woman, with respect of her assumption about the quipus. Against the incredulity of the Duchess to whom the letter is addressed, and who doubted that letters could have been composed in form of quipus, Raimondo de Sangro desired to prove the maravillosa eficacia, the marvelous effectiveness of the quipus. His argument was developed on two levels. The first one considered that the use of characters, hieroglyphs, or signs is as old as mankind and common to all peoples, as proved by historical and biblical texts. For example, in a long development, the three letters of the word to, T-A-U, inscribed on Cain's forehead. This first argument allows Raimondo de Sangro to take distance vis-à-vis the biblical chronology and to indicate that the Incas, like each people, had a symbolic system of communication. Whence the second argument that recalled the users of quipus in Peru as they were described by travelers and missionaries, for making accounts, for communicating news at distance, for teaching historical events to the young princes and nobles, for registering poems and songs. Conjecturing the meaning of colors and figures produced by the threads, Raimondo de Sangro reconstructed the correspondence existing, according to him, between notes, syllables, and sounds. His interpretation of the quipus as a form of writing followed two steps. First, the deciphering of the signs formed by chords, notes, and colors that represented 40 parole maestre, 40 master words, beginning with Pachacamac, Dio creatore dell'universo, that designated the most essential Incas concepts and beliefs. And secondly, the association of the design made by chords and notes with the sounds of each syllable of the words. For example, 4 notes attached to the sign of Pachacamac indicated the 4th syllable, mac, that could be used in the quipu rendition of other words. For example, kumak, beautiful. This brilliant but hypothetical construction of such an ideographic, phonetic, and syllabic system was based on the acquisition by Raimondo de Sangro of a manuscript previously owned by the Jesuit Pedro Illanes, entitled Historia Rudimenta Lingue Peruanorum, that contained a short dictionary and a grammar of the language used during the time of the Incas. It is the hypothesis of a correspondence between syllable and notes, between sounds and threads, that led Raimondo de Sangro to propose a rendition in quipu of a song, a canzone, Cumac Nusta, transcribed by another Jesuit, Blas Valera, who said he found it among the notes of very ancient annals. It was a syllabic decomposition of the master words that associated colored threads, knots, and figures with different syllables of the Inca language that allowed Raimondo de Sangro to print this quipu transcription of the song. Beyond this deciphering that confirmed for him the verisimilitude of Graffigny's novel, Raimondo de Sangro went further and affirmed that the quipus could be or must be substituted to alphabetic writing. I quote on number 3, I became so familiar with the practice of the quipu that if it were not for the scruple I have for doing harm to poor publishers and printers, I would like to undertake with all efforts the total abolition of our writing. At the end of his letter, he presented systematic equivalences between the notes and colors of the quipus and the letter of the alphabet, not the syllable of the word, but the letter of the alphabet, but also the blank spaces and different signs, comma, period, accents, and also a new mark he invented for indicating irony, used by the writing systems common to the different European languages. All previously, as previously, the sign of the language of deaf and dumb people, or later, the choreographies of the ballet d'action, both analyzed by Sofia Rosenfeld. Raimondo de Sangro's quipus, miei quipus, as he said, embodied the fantasy of the desire for an archy writing supplementing, or as every Derrida supplement, substituting the alphabetic one. Graffigny, Raimondo de Sangro, the author of the article in the Journal de Trévoux, shared the same source of information, the French translation of Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, Comentario Reales, published in Lisbon in 1609. Graffigny mentioned the author, but not the title of his book in the historical introduction added to the letters in their edition of 1752. I quote, Garcilaso says that the Peruvians had a sort of music and even some kind of poetry. Raimondo de Sangro is more precise, indicating in marginal notes numerous references to the Histoire des Incas, but without mentioning the name of its author. The review in the Journal des Savants, the Journal de Trévoux, gave both name and title, indicating that Raimondo de Sangro consulted l'Histoire des Incas par Garcilaso de la Vega and found in this book all the details about the quipus. The first French translation of Garcilaso de las Vega's book had been established by Jean Baudouin and published in Paris by Augustin Courbet in 1633. The book was republished, the translation of Garcilaso, in 1704 in Amsterdam because, as indicated the publisher, I quote, this history is as curious as it is rare. Since a long time, it can be found either in French or in Spanish, only in some private libraries, and its excessive price in the auctions clearly indicated the necessity to publish it again. This 1704 edition was followed by two other editions of the French translation of Garcilaso de la Vega in Amsterdam in 1715 and in 1737 with engravings in this case. In all these editions, as in the first Spanish edition, the chapter devoted to the quipus are the chapter 8 and 9 of book 6. Raimondo de Sangro, we know this because we have the inventory of his library, owned a copy of the 1715 French translation. When he indicated that the quipus were used for registering memorable actions and exceptional events, the marginal notes indicate Histoire des Incas, Volume 2, Book 6, Chapter 9. It is more difficult to know what edition of Garcilaso's translation was read by Françoise de Graffigny, because a new translation of the book was made by a group of scientists, of naturalists, working at the Parisian Jardin des Plantes, and this translation, the new one, was published in 1744. The title page indicated that the Histoire had been nouvellement traduite, newly translated, and mise dans un meilleur ordre, put into a better order, with the addition of numerous footnotes. The two chapters dedicated by Garcilaso to the quipus were reduced to a single chapter, the chapter 21 of the second volume. We can suppose, as did Niels Safier, that Graffigny was using not only an edition of Baudouin translation, but also this new edition published during the time she was working on her novel. For Graffigny, as for Raimondo de Sangro, and for the Journal de Trévoux, Garcilaso's book was the most important source of information about the quipus. However, it was not the only one. The Neapolitan prince quoted and translated on page 245 of his Lettera Apologetica a passage extracted from the Relation du voyage dans la mer du Sud, written by Amédée François Fraisier, published in 1716, translated into English the year after, 1717. Number 4. The quipus are understood by Fraisier as a secret knowledge. I quote the English translation. The Indians, to keep the account of their flocks and preserve the memory of particular affairs, make use of notes, knots. I don't know what is the right pronunciation. Knots. Knots in wool, which by the variety of colors and knitting serve instead of characters and writing. The knowledge of these knots, which they call quipus, is a science and a secret, which parents do not reveal to their sons till they think themselves near their end. And as it often happens, for want of a ready wit, they do not comprehend the mystery. Those notes occasion them to mistake and so become of no use. To supplant the want of writing, they employ those who have good memories to learn the history of their country and to recite it to others. The author of the Journal de Trévoux recalled that several texts had already explained, I quote, the color and uses of these small cords with knots, travelogues, history of Southern America, or Spanish dictionaries. This last allusion was an implicit reference to the article quipus in the 5th volume of the Dictionary of the Royal Academy, known as the Diccionario de Autoridades, published in 1737, number 5, that defined the quipus as rails of strings knotted with different knots and various colors, with which the Indians of Peru made up for the lack of writing, la falta de escritura. The Lettres d'une Péruvienne mention another book in the historical introduction, the Cérémonies et coutumes religieuses des peuples idolâtres, published in Amsterdam in 1723 by Bernard Picard and Jean-Frédéric Bernard. Graffigny reference to this book, a book that changed Europe, according to Linant, Margaret Jacob, which not means not, did not concern the quipus, but she could have read the chapter dedicated to religion in the Western Indies under the title, In What Manner the American Transmitted Any Memorable Incident to Posterity, according to the 1731 English translation of this book. Picard indicated the Peruvians, number 6, the Peruvians had neither letters nor characters after the manner of the Chinese, nor figures as the Arabians, nor hieroglyphics after the manner of the Egyptians. They had, in general, no other registers or memorials than oral tradition and the quapas or quipus. It would be a difficult matter to conceive all that these strings represented or how far it assisted the memory. Suffice it that we say they served them for annals, codes, laws, ritual, ceremonial, and so on, and that with these strings, knots, and colors, they made as many different combinations as we with the letters of our alphabets. For Graffigny and Raimondo de Sangro, even if they were quoting other books, the two chapters devoted by Garcilaso de la Vega to the Quipus remained the most fundamental reference, as it was also for Picard himself, who copied very long passages extracted from the Histoire des Incas du Pérou and acknowledged that he was copying Garcilaso de la Vega in French translation. In his two chapters devoted to the Quipus, Inca Garcilaso underlined the difference between two different uses of the threads and knots, as numbers allowing accounts, as memorial devices allowing to remember historical events. Chapter 8 of Book 6 was exclusively devoted to the uses of the Quipus for reckoning foodstuffs, weapons, inhabitants, and devoted also to the Quipucamayos, defined as those who have charge of these accounts. Chapter 9, however, gave to the Quipu other function, number 7. Of course, the notes remain fundamentally a device for accounting. They indicate numbers, not words. I quote, Incas may be said to have recorded on their notes everything that could be counted, even mentioning battles and fights, all the embassies that had come to visit the Inca, all the speeches and arguments the king has uttered. But the purpose of the embassies, or the contents of the speeches, or any other descriptive matter could not be recorded on the notes, consisting as it did of continuous spoken words, which cannot be expressed by means of notes, since they can give only numbers and not words. It is the reason why speeches were committed to memory and transmitted orally, and the reason why fables and poems expressed speeches and deeds. I quote again Garcilaso, everything that could not be recorded on the notes was included in these poems, which were sung at their triumph, the triumph of the Incas, and on the occasion of their greater festivals, and recited to the young Incas when they were armed knights. Thus, they remembered their history. Fable and poems, however, were perishable expedients, because only letters can perpetuate the memory of events. Incas ignored them, but, wrote Garcilaso in a statement more or less contradictory with what he has said previously, they treated notes as letter, como si los nudos fueran letras. The Quipucamayos, the officer who have charge of the notes, memorized their meaning. For them, the Quipus were records not only of events, but also of laws, ordinances, customs, and ceremonies. I quote Garcilaso, from the color of the thread and the number of the knots, they would tell what law prohibited any particular offense and what penalty was to be applied to anyone who broke it. They could say that what sacrifices or ceremony was performed in honor of the sun on such and such festival. They could state what ordinance or privilege afforded protection to widows or the poor or wayfarers. In this way, they could provide information on any other matters that had been memorized and handed down by tradition. Each thread and note suggested the meaning attributed to it. And it was such a knowledge which was the reason of the power of this officer, the Quipucamayos. For Garcilaso, esta fue la manera de escribir que los Incas tuvieron en su república. This was the method of writing that the Incas employed in their republic. Baudouin's 1623 French translation, republished after in the beginning of the 18th century, did not compare quipus and writing, but he considers them as the equivalent of poems and stories. I quote the translation: great deeds can only be immortalized thanks to the letters, but as the Incas had no knowledge of them, they used whatever they could invent to suit their purpose. In the English translation of Garcilaso de la Vega, published by Paul Ricotte in 1688, the text is profoundly transformed. But what is important, fable, verses, and quipus are presented as ingenious but powerless attempts for substituting letters. I quote the translation: all which, notwithstanding, were faint representation and imperfect conservatory of true history, in comparison of the reports we deliver to faithful writings and letters which perpetuate the memory of action to all ages. Howsoever, we may here observe the ingenuity of the people who aside and offered at something like our letters, though it were by notes and novels and hieroglyphics and verses. Such is the desire of mankind to perpetuate their beings in the memory and minds of all ages. According to Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, Zilia could have used the colored thread for making accounts or eventually for remembering a particular event, but her quipu could not be letters in both sense of the word. It is also what thought the incredulous duchess to whom Raimondo de Sangro addressed his lettera. Cornelius de Pau shared this incredulity. In his Recherches philosophiques sur les Américains, published in 1768, de Pau used Garcilaso for refuting the Prince of San Severo. Number 8. I know that an Italian named San Severo recently claimed that he has rediscovered the secret of the ancient Peruvians, brought by means of a few strings variously tied and colored. But it is sure that the Indians never wrote as San Severo imagined. Garcilaso agrees that the quipos became mute and useless when they were not interpreted and helped by the verbal tradition of the Camayos. So laws and ordinances has to be learned by heart by a few people who retain them in their memory, since it was not possible to state the content of a sanction or a civil pact with the courts, as it is easy to imagine for anyone who has the right idea of these shapeless instruments. In a note, de Pau quoted Garcilaso's contradictory description of the quipos and concluded, it follows from this very obscure description that the quipos were only used to make calculations, such as we made with Pascal instrument, allusion to the mechanical calculator invented by Pascal in 1642. For de Pau, to imagine letters composed with thread and notes could be only a novelistic and fictional invention. Not everyone, however, accepted to dismiss the possibility to write with the quipus, with the chords. In the encyclopedia, number 9, the article quipus, published in the volume 13 in 1765, was written, as many others, by Jaucourt. It begins with a reference to Fraisier travelogue, I have already quoted, encyclopedia, quipos, woolen knots, which were and still are, according to Mr. Fraisier's report, used by the American Indians to keep an account of their business and commodities. To understand this usage, it is necessary to know that all the Indians at the time of the discovery of America by the Spaniards had cotton cords of a certain size, to which they occasionally tied other small cords to remind themselves by the number, by the variety of colors of these cords, and by knots placed from distance to distance of the various things they wanted to remember. This is what they call quipos. They served as writing instruments and memorial annals. It's a quotation of Fraisier by the encyclopedia. And Jaucourt wanted to give example of the use of the quipus. For doing this, he quoted several passages extracted from three texts, in fact, three letters. And these three letters were the first, second, and fourth letters noted by Zilia in Graffigny's novel. Thus, for Jaucourt, the literary fiction paradoxically authenticated Fraisier's testimony by contradicting it. The quipus were not only able to remember, as shown by Zilia, they could also express and convey thoughts, feelings, and sentiments. This debate about the quipus must be located within the circulation of books that, since the Spanish conquest, have described the Peruvian chords and knots, knowing that perhaps no one of all the authors I have mentioned until now have ever seen a quipu. So they were entirely, totally dependent of the description, and particularly the description of the text I should like to consider now, that is to say, the text of the Spanish conquest. Raimondo de Sangro mentioned two of them. His references did not allude directly or specifically to passages on the quipus, but to the fact that the Incas, thanks to their perfect moral sense and penetrating knowledge of the natural law, must be situated among the best people in the world. Pedro Cieza de León is quoted first. His Chronicle del Perú, published in Seville in 1553, was one of the earliest, if not the earliest, circulated description of the quipus. The book was translated into Italian in 1555 and republished 7 times by Venetian publisher between 1556 and 1576. In chapter 82, Cieza de León described the quipus as allowing precise accounts of tributes deposited in published warhouse, aposentos. In the 1709 English translation, Captain John Stevens indicated, number 10, they kept their accounts exactly on knots in clusters of strings of several colors, very ingenious, though we cannot understand them, and this was added by the translator, by Stephen, though we cannot understand them. And this they call quipos. Cieza de León book was never translated into French until the 20th century. The second book mentioned by Raimondo de Sangro was most famous, the Historia Natural y Moral de los Indios, published by José Acosta in 1590, translated into Italian in 1596, in French in 1598, and in English in 1604. Acosta and his French or English translator shared the same observation. I quote, "Before the Spaniards came to the Indies, there of Peru are no kind of writing, either letters, characters, ciphers, figures like those of China or Mexico. They supply the want of letters and writing by the quipos." However, if Acosta compared the quipos with alphabetic writing, because they were signs endowed with multiple meanings, he didn't say that they were equivalent of letters. The English translator, Edward Grimston, was less prudent and identified knots with words. I quote, "According to the variety of business as words, policy, tributes, ceremonies, and lands, there were sundry quipos or branches, in every one of the which there were so many knots, little and great, and strings tied unto them, some red, some green, some blue, some white, and finally such diversity that even as we derive an infinite number of words from the 24 letters, applying them in diverse sorts, so do they draw innumerable words from their knots and diversity of colors." A third book can be added to the possible reading by Madame de Graffigny, Agustín de Zarate, Historia del Descubrimiento y Conquista del Perú, published in Antwerp in 1555. The book was translated into English in 1581 and into French in 1706, with a new edition in 1742, number 12. For Zarate, the quipus are both instruments for accountings and memorial devices. I quote, "The natural of that country knew neither writing nor reading, not even certain pictures with the Indians of New Spain, Mexico, used in lieu of books, so that their record or register did chiefly consist in memory from one to another. But their accounts or reckoning of time were made upon a string of cord made of cotton wool, which the Indian called quipus. In every province were officers who had the charge to keep the things in memory with those cords, which were called quipocamayo, so that many public houses were found full of those cords, and the said officers could by them easily declare any matter concerning their effect. Also, it had been of many years past. In the 1740s, when Graffigny worked on a novel, a reading of Zarate, published in 1742, could have been associated by her with the new translation of Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, printed in 1744, for inspiring her quipus fiction. It is perhaps surprising for you that I did not add in this early modern European library about the quipus the chronicle completed by Guaman Poma in 1615. Indeed, the manuscript contained the most famous and quite unique early modern drawings representing quipus as a document transmitted by messengers, as accounting tool for secretaries and treasurers, as inventories of state storehouses. If I did not put it among Graffigny or Sansevero actual or possible readings, it is because Guaman Poma's manuscript that was sent as a letter to the King Philip III and was entered in the 1660s into the King of Denmark library in Copenhagen, where it is still now, this letter chronicle was never printed nor circulated before his first edition in 1936. Graffigny's book initiated in 1748 the French interest for Inca's writing. In the foreword of her book, she presented her novel as a reply to the unjust prejudice and despise suffered by the people of the Indies. I quote, "Enriched by the priceless spoils of Peru, we should at least consider the inhabitant of this part of the world to be a magnificent people, and a feeling of respect is not very far removed from the recognition of magnificence." She praised the initiator of such a rare appraisal. One of our finest poets has evoked this Indian's custom in a poem dramatique, a verse drama, which has surely helped to make them better known. The allusion, evident for our readers, was to Voltaire's tragedy Alzire, ou Les Américains, performed in January 1736. Voltaire's Incas were without quipus, but with noble souls. Even if the edition of the play indicated that the stage in the city of Los Reyes, otherwise Lima, Voltaire's Peruvians, but also the Spanish governors, are moral characters, much more than historical actors. As Voltaire wrote in his dedicatory epistle to Madame du Châtelet, "I try to paint this generous feeling, this humanity, this greatness of soul that does good and forgives." In his tragedy, the only notes were the notes of love, not the notes of the quipus. The year before, Rameau Ballet Heroic, Les Indes Galantes, had inaugurated the Inca fever of fashion. The second entry is located in a desert in Peruvian mountains terminated by a volcano, says the text. The Festival of the Sun ends with an earthquake, the defeat of perfidious Huáscar and the union between the Inca princess Fanny Pala and the Spanish officer Don Carlos. In the printed libretto, his author, Louis Fuselier, mentioned as source of his inspiration, I quote, Garcilaso de la Vega, Inca historian of Peru, indicating that the curious will learn all about the Incas from this Indian author. You remember, Garcilaso de la Vega was a mestizo. And Fuselier added that frequent earthquakes in Peru are attested by, I quote, the naturalists who confirm the testimonies of the travelers, and that the verisimilitude of Fanny's superstitious terror in front of this earthquake is authenticated, I quote, by Antoine de Solis, the author of the History of the Conquest of Mexico, and by Augustin de Zarate, who are, I quote Fuselier, the best-known historian, relateur of the conquest of Mexico and Peru. The book that culminated the French Incas fever before the revolution was Marmontel, Les Incas ou la destruction de l'Empire du Pérou, published in 1777. Presented as a book in which, I quote, there is too much truth for a novel and not enough for history. Quoting in the first page of the preface Las Casas, the apostle of the Indies, this virtuous prelate, denouncing the tyranny and crime of the Spaniards, but recognizing also that these crimes were denounced by the Spaniards themselves. Marmontel's book described also Incas without quipus, or almost without them, number 13. In the second chapter, devoted as the end gallant to the Festival of the Sun, the laws are read out loud from a book, I quote, composed of strings of 1,000 different colors. And the text follows, notes that were made in them serve for characters. And this contrivance sufficed for expressing a set of laws simple as the manners and concern of the people they directed. But in Marmontel, as in Voltaire's Inca, ne, notes are not for blood, for hymen, not for keep. If Rameau's Peru, in my conclusion, was centered on the celebration of the Festival of the Sun, the French text devoted to the quipus ignored their religious uses, either condemned or transformed by the Spanish colonization. On the one hand, the quipu must be destroyed because they were memories of the ancient superstitions. The Third Provincial Council held in Lima in 1582-83 required such eradication, number 14. As among the Indians, ignorant of letters, instead of books, there was a series of signs held up by various courts that they called quipus, and where not a few memories of the ancient superstitions subsist, as well as the memory of their rites, ceremonies, and iniquitous laws is preserved. Let the bishops take care to destroy completely all these pernicious instruments. On the other hand, at the same time, quipus were used as numerical and memorial devices for recording the sins that must be confessed to Catholic priests. Acosta mentioned and encouraged this Christian usage of the quipu. I quote number 15, "I did see a handful of these strings wherein an Indian woman carried written a general confession of all her life, and thereby confessed herself, as well as I could have done it in written paper. I asked her what those strings meant that differed from the rest. She answered me, there were certain circumstances which the sin required to be fully confessed." Deprived from religious significance, the quipus were located in 18th century France, and perhaps in all Europe, within an interpretive tension, a tension between accounting tool, memorial device, and narrative writing. But in spite of Raimondo de Sangro's ingenuousness, their textile texts remained until now undeciphered. Thank you.
Okay, the floor is open. Thank you, Roger. Liliana, the first question, please.
Roger, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. You have described basically two clusters of discussion. The one whether the quipu is just a financial instrument, something for numbers, a memorial device for the counting of events, rather than descriptive or even letters. The second cluster is whether the knots can be translated into a syllabic or into an alphabetic language. Let me add a third topic, namely what happens if I think of the knots as also something that I can unwrite and undo, because unlike print, you can open a knot fairly easily, perhaps, or easier. And I can even push the point and say that Graffigny's novel is not so much or not only about tying knots, but also untying knots, both symbolically as a love relationship, but also in content when she gets it back or translates it or puts it away. So is there any, I'm channeling Peter Stuyvesant, is there any tradition of the thought of erasure in terms of undoing knots in all of this?
Undoing the knot.
Yeah, as a kind of erasure, yeah.
But first of all, I have to say, paradoxically, perhaps this lecture was not about the quipus, the real quipus, the actual quipus we have seen, thanks to one of the curators who is present today. With John, we visited the museum, and of course, we saw the 16 real quipus. In this case, the quipus of this text I mentioned, as I said, and perhaps we have the exception, but it's very debated, that Raimondo de Sangro had seen, had acquired with the manuscript I mentioned of Ilanes, some quipus coming from Peru. I suppose no one has seen the actual quipus. And also the discussion about the function of the quipus, particularly debated by anthropologists, is something which has an echo with the text I mentioned, but of course there are two different levels of realities. And I have never seen in the text I have used for this lecture any allusion to the unnoting, if I can say, of the quipu. The only allusion, of course, are in the mathematical perspective, the ranking of the quipu, and there are some people more knowledgeable than myself here to answer the fact that you have a system of 10. It's a decimal system, and you can have a series of different levels for the 10 or 100 or 1,000, and it works well, this. But the use for other purpose, and particularly what you mentioned, I have no knowledge about it. And in the text I have analyzed, there are no mention of this. What remains is the fact that some anthropologists have considered that some of the quipu, which were conserved, I think there are more or less 900 quipu in the different museums in the world, and two main collections being at the Ethnologische Museum in Berlin and the Museum of Natural History in New York. And here, 16, it's not so bad. There is, thanks to you, I have checked there is a databasis of all the quipus in the world, and you have, of course, in some of the Peruvian museum, the Museo Larco, the museum at Pachacamac, the site of the divinity. But normally, they correspond to this model in which you have not to untie, you have just to count and to use for numerous mathematical or accounting purposes. Some of them didn't fit this structure. And it was the reason why the debate or the discussion I mentioned for the 18th century as a form of contemporary reality, when some of the anthropologists, for example, Gary Horton, saw that perhaps beyond the accounting uses, this abnormal, weird quipu meant something else. And either could be considered, which could be accepted as memorial device under the condition that someone has memorized the deeds or the facts, the events which correspond to the quipu. But it's the same thing, for example, for the notched sticks of wood for the Indian of North America, in which you have a memory constructed by the users of a stick of woods, and in which each notch could correspond to an event, but known by the people who have either notched the sticks or knowing what was the correspondence. Beyond this, some hypotheses are about the narrative dimension of the quipu. Alors, to destroy the knot would be to erase the narration. The narrative dimension, which is difficult to prove because, as shown by the anthropologists, we have never a strict correspondence between an actual quipu and an explanation of what is the quipu. The quipu were used in the 16th and 17th century as documents that could prove, in cases, property. But in this case, we have not necessarily the quipus, only the Spanish transcription of what was said in relation with the quipu. And the same thing with some Indian narrative, they are not corresponding to the quipu. So there are not possibility to match an object, a given quipu, and a text, whatever the text may be. And it's the reason why that it's an open discussion. But I was struck by the fact that the contemporary discussion has something as a mirror of the debate of the early modern period, even if in the early modern period there was a temptation by Madame de Graffigny or by Raimondo de Sangro, to go further in the narrative dimension of the quipu.
Let's go to Zoom, and Jim Perricone, please. You can unmute and ask your question. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Speak up.
Okay, great. I just took the mute off. I may be like the hammer for whom everything looks like a nail in asking this question, but you got to the edge of, but not quite saying what I kept thinking during much of the talk, that the fascination with the quipu is a fascination with figuring out an alternative way of preserving the essential sound nature of language that, for the most part, we have found through writing, as you said, and you did talk about the tension between the memory of essentially the world of orality through writing and into then narrative writing and, of course, printing. But the preservation of sound is one of the great fascinations of the transition between oral and literate. At least it's been a fascination of mine, and I think it's been a fascination of mankind. And I think that may be why so many writers, you have found really a rather astonishing number of writers from different Western cultures who have been fascinated with the quipu. I think it's precisely for this reason, because it's such an interesting alternative way of preserving the evanescent nature of the sound of language. And I just think it's great the way, it's brilliant the way you put it all together.
Thank you. So the question of sound and and how the Europeans were intrigued by this. Yeah.
It was one of the main issues, that is to say, is it possible to understand the quipu as a phonetic system? And this is what the ingenuousness or fiction or by Raimondo de Sangro, they consider, because you have these books in which you have something about the language of the ancient Inca. We can think it was the Quechua. And he had reconstructed a system of sign for the quipu. He made the correspondence between the sound of the syllable and some of the sign of the quipu reconstructed as in order of figures. And we have seen the beautiful engraving he made, included on his own press and with multicolored quipu. So this was one of the ways in which there is this link between phonetic and sign. The other interpretation in the 18th century, as today, I think, has disconnected this relationship. And if there is an orality, it's the orality of the people who have memorized the meaning of the quipu. Not because the quipu itself could be understood as a system which has a phonetic dimension, but because the transmission of the content referred to by the quipu was memorized and transmitted orally. So there are two modalities, finally, of the relationship you mentioned between the vocal, the oral, the speech on the one hand, and the other hand, the inscription. Could be by writing, or could be by the form of archi-writing, that is to say, the sign, the color, notes of the quipu. But right. Of course, you're absolutely right. It's a main issue, which was perhaps since the 18th century, and could be still debated today by anthropologists who has worked with what remain of the use of some of the quipu in some community in Peru, or using the material collected in the I think, the first part of the 20th century, and which has constructed the collection of quipus in the European Museum, and the same tension. But perhaps the phonetic hypothesis à la Sangro as less important. What remains would be the narrative. Hurton has coined the expression of the accounting narrative quipu. That is the structure of the accounting could be the place in which some narrative could be inscribed. So even in this case, he maintained the dimension of accounting as absolutely fundamental for the construction of the object.
And Anne Tibali, who is here tonight, has, first of all, some samples, but also a brilliant attempt to reconstruct in quipus a narrative of, no, I'm not supposed to say this.
We have to guess.
Oh, okay. A narrative relating to historical events of our community, which she can touch on later in afterwards. Thank you. Neil Safier, hello. Nice to have you.
Hello, thank you. Delightful to be able to participate. As usual, Roger, you've done an incredible job of, dare I say, braiding together various narratives. And I think you've done it both lyrically, but also in a way that challenges some of the linguistic divisions that have sort of often described the way that these stories have been told. I had basically two questions. One that was sort of alluded to before about the quipus themselves and whether or not there is evidence of quipus coming into European collections in the 18th century, or whether that is, and whether that offers us an opportunity to try to bring these different material and literary histories together. The other question relates to the impact of Graffigny and these French accounts in the Spanish world. And I personally am not aware of any Spanish reaction to any of the, of these French texts really in the second half of the 18th century, which strikes me as really odd, because on some level, it is such an incredibly rich literary and theatrical and musical phenomenon in the French world, and yet there is kind of a deafening absence in the Spanish world. So I wonder if you have, you've done a wonderful job of bringing those, 16th century Spanish texts to bear. But, have you found any kind of evidence of any response or reaction in the latter part of the 18th century?
Yeah, it's a paradoxical situation because on the one hand, all the information about the quipu was given historically by the text associated with the conquest. But none of the texts I have mentioned quote directly a Spanish text. That is to say, Graffigny used the French translation, and perhaps your translation, if I can say, the 1744 translation. The Raimondo de Sangro, for example, for Ciesa de Leon, used the Italian translation. And so the mediation of the translation is absolutely fundamental for the access to the original Spanish text. And we have to reconsider this. And if you make an history in which you are not you're worried by what kind of text could have been read, such an author, you can go directly to Garcilaso de la Vega. But the edition we have, 1609, Comentarios Reales, in the inventory after death of Garcilaso, you have 500 copies. So I don't know what he has made with these 500 copies, but it indicates that the circulation of the original Spanish text was very limited. Your question is about the other side of the question, and I think the answer would be the same. As I said, Graffigny was translated into Spanish only in 1792, very late, in the moment of illustration, Moratin, the moment in which in Spain there is something more open to French or English literature. Is the time of the first translation of Hamlet by Moratin from the original English text. And so it's a very, an influence, if there is an influence, very late and in another context. So the paradox is that all this history is based on the Spaniard entering into Peru. And in fact, the Spanish texts are not really known. And conversely, all these texts, I suppose it's the same thing for Raimondo de Sangro in Italian or in French, are not known in Spain before the late 18th century.
Yeah, it's fair enough.
What was the first question?
They're both very well known and not known at all. So Neil's first question was about actual quipus being present in European collections that we can document as early as the 18th century. And this is sort of an interesting question about history of museums and what might be the Renaissance or later Enlightenment inventories of certain places.
Thanks to our colleague from the museum here, I consulted the databases of this, all the quipu in all the museums of the world, and the immense majority is always indicated as non-documented and without any date. And sometimes there are some.
And date of collection is always not often much later,
it's
right?
very
20th
difficult.
century,
And
19th
there is
century.
a debate because, of course, if the Council of Lima of 1582-83 was efficient, a lot, it's like the codices in Mexico, a lot of these quipu have been destroyed. So there could be the survival quipu, the quipu after the first period of the conquest, which were, because some of the population still use them, Christianized and reused as a device for the confession, and in this case accepted as a memorial device, the memory of the scenes. And so it seems to me very difficult to answer this fundamental question. I have seen that some museum has used the carbon-14 in order to try to make the date of the quipu, but it's a very large datation between 15th and 18th century.
But it might be that we have more work to do to find out when certain quipus arrived in Germany, arrived in Italy. Maybe there were some, I guess you were not sure whether Raimondo de Sangro could have seen an actual one in the Vatican or some other place.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think because the majority of this museum, the collection were constructed in the 19th century. And if I remember, in the museum here, the Penn Museum, it's a mission of the 1920s or something like this, was gathered some quipu. So it's a very fundamental question, but for measuring the effect of the decree by the provincial council asking for the destruction, and so what has survived of this, and secondly, for the users in the 16th or 17th century in the judicial cases, and after in the practice of the confession. The two users which were documented by a document outside of the quipu, the declaration not only of Acosta but also other people of the church, or there is an entire book that Javier indicated to me about the cases in justice in the 16th century in order to debate the appropriation of land using the quipu as a possible argument or instrument by some of the defendants or some of the people involved in the case. And in this case, there are a transcription by the Spaniard of the content which was declared being the content of the quipu.
Yeah.
But the quipu are not necessarily kept, and so you cannot make like for the stone of Rosetta. You cannot make this correspondence to match a text and a quipu, which could be the only way for solving the difficult question of the decipherability of the quipu. And I remember Frank Salomon, a great specialist, saying, on the one side, we have quipus with elaborate formal structure and internal mathematical patterns. On the other side, we see Andean domains of activity or thought said to have been encoded in codes, but finding promising matches has proven terribly difficult. So it's a impossibility to make this concurrent.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I had two questions. It may be simply a result of the selection of extracts that you've given us, but two questions about what I was surprised there wasn't more of. One, it was only in one of the texts, the Picara, that you get the comparison of quipus to other forms of non-alphabetic and non-European writing. So you have the Chinese characters, figures of the Arabians. I'm not sure what they're talking about there. They just think it's a non-alphabetic script, and the hieroglyphics of the Egyptians. So I was wondering if there's more of that. I would have expected more kind of assimilation of the quipus into other forms of text that Europeans had encountered elsewhere that they found alien to them. And then the second thing that struck by the woman who says she's encoded her sins in the quipu, this kind of adaptation to a Christian. Are there any? I would have thought, I expected some comment either from Catholic sources or from Protestant sources comparing this to the Rosary,
The
Rosary, as a memorial device. Either sort of, I could see Protestant. I mean, if it were in the 16th century, I would imagine you find Protestants attacking this as a kind of sign of the idolatry of Catholics, or Catholic sources later maybe comparing this, but didn't see any of that. So is that just an accident of the one, or is that really missing from both of those comparisons?
The comparison is made. I don't think we read it by Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, which explained that himself, when he went to a sanctuary, used the quipu as, now he has converted to Christianism, the Rosary. So, and also the fact that he mentioned a second device based on sign, that is to say small stones, which are distributed into a figure, and this figure is also a memorial device. So this comparison existed in this case morphologically. In the case of Acosta, more, that is to say, the quipu could be integrated within the Christian rituals, and particularly for the confession. So there are two different approaches. One approach, which is a morphological comparison. There are different systems for remembering, in particular remembering the religious doctrine. And the other one could be the process of Christianization of a device which was condemned as linked, associated with the previous superstition. The first question is important because it seems to me it could be located in a moment in which, like the Picard, it's the reason why our former colleague Linant and Margaret Jacob said it was a book which changed the world, because it's a moment of a form of comparative historical analysis of the different religions, and without necessarily encompassing them into a form or another, the relation with the Christianism, but a display in an horizontal series of religion. And it's the reason why I quote this chapter, but you have seen, I don't know who has read the totality of Coutume, Ceremony, it's an enormous work, but it's the reason why you are absolutely right. But this could be located, it seems to me, in a specific period of time, perhaps the late 17th century, a specific form of philosophy or spirituality. It's a book printed in Amsterdam.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
the idea that a comparative approach detached from any credo or any affirmation of an orthodoxy could be the moment in which the different, and beyond this, there was this question of the morphology. When I said, I parody in a sense when I said this seminar is with the other seminar about non-alphabetic writing, the notches on the wood sticks in England, 16th century, or Indian population in America, 19th century, perhaps what we could say with the writing by the other form of this inscription without the wampum. And in the museum here, there is a comparison in an article of between the wampum and the quipu, the belt made with the shells, and which has also this relationship to substitute to writing or to be added to writing. When the wampums were used for religious purpose, of course, they were located within a world of words.
Mhm.
But they are also documented, the wampum, without any form of written system, but in itself. And also it was it, and the hieroglyphs, or as you know, as you have said, I don't know what are the Arabic figures, which are, but the hieroglyphs or the picturas in Mexico, the codices, were the comparison, please.
Let's get Peter online. Hi, Peter and Annie.
Thank you, Roger, for a wonderfully rich and stimulating talk. It was fabulous. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent.
Particularly if you say this.
My question really is about a possible absence, or rather like Neil's question. So Neil's question was, why isn't there such a big take up amongst the Spanish world? Mine comes from a rather different world, which is, what is the desire for quipus to be textual and narrative systems at the very point in Europe where people are thinking far more about the world, the actual cosmology in terms of mathematics. And I'm wondering whether if there's any attempts to think about the relationship between quipus and cosmology. In other words, when you're looking at the Inca society and you're looking at many of these early societies, they have highly developed astrological systems. They have highly elaborated cosmological systems, often which actually draw upon very sophisticated mathematics. And so I would have expected, when you're looking for sophisticated civilizations, you'd go more to mathematics than to look at more obvious things like textual and narrative systems.
Yeah, there are two elements, text and textile, and this cosmological dimension. I have not seen, neither in the text of the 18th century nor in what I have read about the contemporary anthropology, this immediate relationship which could exist between the numeral system of the quipu and a vision of the world. I don't know. I have not encountered any indication, as if there were two domains, separated domains. One, the quipu as a practical accounting, and the cosmological system, which can have also a basis about number, but not related to the quipu. Seems to me there was this division. After this question of the textile and the text, yes, that's very important. And you are author of a famous book about this with Annie here, writing not with a pen, but with
The needle, yeah.
the needle. And so, of course, but Yeah, but writing with a needle was also writing something which is an alphabetic writing. And you can just produce it, not only with the pen and with the ink. Here it's to write, if it is writing, it's one of the main debates. I have tried to show by uncertainty in the comparison made by different texts or translation of text between what the Western world defined, or European one defined as a writing, and the use of the quipu beyond the accounting as form of memorial or narrative device. But here, in this case, it's the textile would have its intrinsic characteristic. It's not the support for something which would be external, like the alphabetic or even syllabic writing. But I think, yes, it's there is this dimension of textile which appear here very, very strongly. But for the cosmology, perhaps our Italian could have this idea, because when they start with the decomposition of the word of the Peruvian language, he start and the parole maestri, he start with Pachacamac, the supreme divinity, which is not a kind of the spirit of and Garcia Lasso has a lot of development for the Spaniards have completely misunderstood this idea of the Pachacamac, if it could be a little the equivalent of the god of the Christianity, and not one of the idols of the Inca people. And so here, there is something starting with the idea that the order of the world dominated by this figure of Pachacamac, first of the image, first of the quipu interpreted by Raimondo de Sangro, could be the key for understanding the totality of the system. Alors, in this sense, but it's not directly a presence of cosmology within the quipu. I have never seen anyone claiming that it could be understood in this sense.
Maybe a final question from Davida.
Thank you. So I want to pick up a notion that Lilian offered at the beginning of the persistence or permanence of the quipu as a record of a specific historical set of events. And comparing the quipu as an accounting system to the widespread ancient use of something like an abacus, where with an abacus, there isn't any notion of permanence or persistence whatsoever, because the same device is being used over and over again. On the other hand, there's also a uniformity that is, in an abacus. If you understand the system of an abacus, anybody would look at the abacus and get the same reading from it. But it's not necessarily clear that there would be a system of, I think we're kind of assuming that there should be a uniformity across different quipus of something like the size of the knots or the colors or the lengths or things like that. But we can easily, I can imagine that there wouldn't be necessarily any requirement for uniformity depending on material being tied or dye lots or who knows what. And maybe we're imposing the assumption that there ought to be some kind of uniformity. Certainly the system of using knots and lengths and so on is something that must have been widespread and of long duration over history. But the idea that people would have been giving down the same system from father to son and so on and so forth if it was a clan-based thing or a family-based thing, I don't know that we would need to assume that that would be the same in another village on the other side of the mountain.
I think it's a fundamental discussion. I have not the competence for answering, because of course one of the discussion was in a centralized empire like the Inca Empire, the circulation of this quipu as a tool for administration must necessarily convey a shared language. If not, it would not be useful. Alors, so it could be perhaps related with, in this sense, the strictly accounting dimension of the quipu. Because I'd like to say the abacus, and on one of the image of Guaman Poma show both quipu and counter, something like this. Alors, so the universality, at least in the frontier of the Inca Empire, and the centralization of the administration lead to your observation. There was something in the quipu which can be deciphered independently of the memory of the quipu Camayos. And so, but this is this limited to the accounting device? Very sophisticated also, as you say, and there are a lot of analysis by mathematicians today to show the complexity and capacity of the system. Or is it beyond this dimension? And in this sense, we should be closer to writing. If there are something beyond the accounting system, which can be shared in the north and the south of this immense empire, there is something which could be considered as a code, but and a shared code. But of what? Of the reference to event. And this reason why Garcilaso de la Vega is contradictory, because he said on the one hand, you remember, the quipu cannot be word, they cannot recall the content of the embassy, the content of the speech. They just can count, give an account of the number of embassy or of the and after in the other text, the chapter after, he mentioned that there was a vehicle for ordinances, laws, the custom, and so on. And so there are this contradiction in Garcilaso de la Vega, but which is articulated with your own question. That is to say, the universality of a system beyond the specific transmission of interpretation, functioning by itself or not. And so it's the reason why there are so many work on the quipu, I think, because it's important, the difficulty to solve this tension between the text of the 16th, 17th century Spanish and appropriated by the author I mentioned, the users of quipu for judicial or religious reason since the 16th century until the contemporary time. And finally, the discussion about the possibility to understand the quipu are not fitting into the strictly mathematical or accounting nature as the vehicle for other elements. And to conclude with the first question, to undo the quipu appear only in one of the texts I mentioned, when Zilia said to Asa that he will use the quipu she sent to him in order to write the answer. It was like in a letter, you erase the content of the letter, you write in the same place, and you send back to the but it's Madame de Graffigny. I don't know if you can consider it's the main authority about the anthropology of quipu.
Well, we're going to have to leave some mysteries on the table along with the books. So thank you, Roger.